Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you're enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have two tiers of support, $3 per month and $7 per month. So again, our Patreon page is patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we're going to be discussing Breakpoint, which is a recent Netflix, docu-series, we could call it.
Yeah.
Which is 5 parts. The 5 episodes. Part 2 of the series, which I believe will have another 5 episodes, will be released in a few months, which will cover the second half of 2022. And these 5 episodes cover the first half of 2022. And within these 5 episodes, we noticed a handful of themes that we're going to discuss that relate to sports psychology and in the mental side of tennis, which we discuss here on this show. And rather than necessarily breaking it down one episode at a time, we're going to talk about some broader themes that we felt emerged in some different episodes. And yeah, definitely, there might be some spoilers here, so I think it's okay to listen or watch this episode, whether you've seen it or not, because I think there's definitely things that can be learned and can be applied to your own tennis game. And so as we start to think about this series and what we saw over those 5 episodes, Brian, what was one of the big themes that you noticed?
Well, I think we identified four things. Maybe the first one that we'll tackle is this idea of team and interpersonal relationships. And, when I think of that, Josh, I always go back to our interview with Natalie Duran-Bush on the gold medal profile, and how a big part of that profile for Canadian Olympic athletes was the interpersonal relationship piece of mental performance, of overall performance. And so I thought we saw aspects of that nearly in all of the episodes, where we've recognized before that tennis is a lonely sport, and it's such an individual solo sport. But yet, as human beings, we have this need to relate to each other, right? This need to be social. And it's really up to players to be able to create some of that. And we saw that even with the first episode with Nick Kyrgios and his performance team, his recently, I think, new girlfriend at the time, because this was 2022 Australian Open. We saw the importance of that. I think we also saw in that episode his partnership with Thanasi Kokkinakis in doubles, and how much joy he was getting out of that whole experience, and also kind of engaging with the crowd. And we've often seen Nick with basketball jerseys on and so forth. And so he just seems to have this need for the team. And I think the evidence shows that that's part of your performance, having those solid relationships in your life. And we can certainly delve a lot into, Nick and some of his own, issues or mental health issues and so forth. But hopefully he continues to grow. And I think that the team piece is a part of that. I think we also saw that with Taylor Fritz and his team. The parent relationship there, the relationship with Paul Annacone was especially interesting, and Paul's role as to tell Taylor when he's not acting or doesn't have a top 10 attitude. I thought that was pretty cool. And then certainly with Felix Auger-Aliassime, and bringing Tony Nadal into the team as a way of improving what was going on there. And certainly Casper Ruud and his team, and his dad also being there and being a really positive influence on what's happening. So I thought that was a nice theme throughout most of the episodes of, how do top level tennis players really combat the loneliness and individuality of the sport, not only through maybe their performance team, but other relationships.
Totally, totally. And I think it's necessary in tennis as an individual sport, as a sport where, it's you competing against other individual athletes, traveling the world, playing against your peers and sometimes your friends, but it can, I think, feel very individual, very lonely. So I think establishing that team around you is really necessary, and I'm glad that they touched on that. And I think you brought up some really good examples there, Brian. I think another one is Ons Jabeur and sort of her unique approach to a team that she's created in terms of having people that she's very close to, I think including her husband, as a part of that team and a fully Tunisian team. But yeah, I think we saw different approaches to teams, whether that be a parent like Casper Ruud, where his dad, was a top ATP player, top 50, or Tony Nadal, who had certainly endless experience with his nephew Rafa, and won many Grand Slam titles between the two of them, and now is working with a relatively younger, very promising player in Felix Auger-Aliassime. So yeah, I agree that that was a theme that kept emerging among those five episodes, and I think for good reason because of certain aspects of the sport that necessitate having that really solid team, and I think we've seen that um, in players that have been really successful over the years, that sort of consistency in their teams, and I think players that maybe are tennis players that are listening to this that are not competing for Grand Slam and Masters titles, can think about what they can do with their own teams, right? Whether it's a junior player, whether it's an adult player playing for a team, playing in tournaments. What does that team around them look like? Is that, do they have a coach? Do they have maybe parents? Do they have a sports psychology professional that they work with? Is it strength and conditioning? What is that team, and how can we maybe learn certain aspects from what the best players in the world do and how they put together their team, when it comes to their own performance team?
Yeah, and we've seen some players who've had less stability in that, and not that it's a direct correlation, but maybe that's why some of these players don't have the consistency in results. It would be we don't have insight into this, so this is pure speculation. But like an Emma Raducanu, who has had several coaches over the last couple of years, hasn't really been able to establish a great deal of consistency in her level. She certainly has the game, the weapons to do that. But so I think that's an aspect of like, all right, can we look for some more stability? And so I think that's a good point, Josh. As even if you're not a top level player, you just like playing recreationally, it's still about relationships, right? So can you be in even just a community of people that you enjoy being with? Because just those positive relationships will bolster your own game. It'll also bolster your own mental health around the game. It is a difficult game in that regard. So there's that. The next theme, I thought, Josh, that I want you to talk about this one first, was expectations. And I thought that this was obviously this was the name of episode 4, which was Great Expectations, but I thought it was also something that featured in some of the other episodes.
Totally, totally. And I think expectations, and then that's definitely something we've discussed in many, many, many of our episodes here of the Tennis IQ podcast. We've talked a lot about that, but I think a couple moments where I saw expectations and sort of getting in a player's way and maybe leading to pressure, um, was first of all when it came to Isla Tomljanovic and the way that she talked about expectations and expecting to win, expecting that her hard work was going to lead to wins and results and an improved ranking and all of that. And I think we often see when a player has too many expectations on themselves, it rather than helping it it increases pressure. It actually makes it harder to perform. And I think, that is in contrast with Iga Swiatek and how she's talked about her and her sports psychology professional, Daria Abramowitz, have talked about trying to really focus on standards, sort of those controllable aspects, the process, rather than expectations. So I thought that was an interesting part where she talked about those expectations. And I think we see other players in this series, even if not, it wasn't talked about in the same explicit way, where, their expectations maybe held them back in certain ways. And I think Paula Badosa is an example here, how, she talked about her expectations. I believe she was had won the tournament in Madrid the year before, and, also as a Spanish player, playing in that tournament, and that leading to expectations, and then that, also making things tougher for her to perform in that moment. And, also facing a very formidable opponent in Simona Halep on clay. But we saw how the expectations impacted her. So I think that was definitely a theme that, is quite a prevalent theme within the sport. And we talk about, how to manage those expectations and maybe what to focus on instead. But I think I like that the series focused on that.
Yeah, and I think you kind of highlighted the two major breakdowns with expectations in the series, which Alia Tomljanovic in the Australian, and then Paula Badosa um, at the Madrid Open. And I like to think of a concept called compete level, which to me is you maintaining a high, consistent standard of performance on controllable behaviors. So your body language, um, your positive mental attitude, your energy, with regard to, say, footwork and being active, your routines, your discipline in terms of, shot selection, patterns that you're playing, etc. And what we saw in both of those matches that they played after, I think, Tomljanovic, as you said, Josh, she kind of created it for herself, right? Expectations of results. I think with Badosa, it was more about, I'm in Spain, I won this tournament last year, and there was just sort of and kind of this environment of pressure to do it again and, do it in her home capital. I don't know that she necessarily was expecting to win, but that maybe there were other things. And so, what did we see in both matches? Was that as the matches went along and they became more difficult, the compete level, again, the level of excellence on these controllable behaviors went way down. And both players, it's when you see sort of a score that's like 4-1 or 4-0, something happened, and really the expectations piece was, I think, a big factor for both of them in how they competed. Um, and so hopefully they can also learn from that a little bit more, right? Because perhaps for both of them it was a necessary experience. We obviously know that, Tomljanovic goes on to have a very good year, and we're going to see more about her in part two with the match that she had at the U.S. Open against Serena. And anybody who remembers that match remembers what an excellent performance that was for her. And so hopefully we see that growth as a result of that. So I did think that was an interesting one, and managing that and working on more of those controllable items and competing well at that, regardless of what's going on, is challenging, but also at that level really really necessary to do.
Absolutely. And I like that you brought up, what happened later in the year with her, with that match against Serena, where certainly there was a lot of pressure, would have been easy to bring a lot of expectations to a match like that. And I often will hear this, and I'm sure you do the same, Brian, with certain players. I should win, I'm supposed to win, I have to, I need to. Anytime I hear things like that, I instantly go to expectations. that's an expectation. I'm supposed to win. I'm expecting to win this match. And then what happens if after 2, 3 games you're down 2-1, you're down 3-0, and you should win. You're supposed to win. What if you lose? And you're telling yourself, hey, this is a match I'm supposed to win. But what if your opponent went out there and played great? What if it came down to just a couple of points? So can we learn as tennis players to manage that? And I think going back to Tomljanovic, she did that really well against Serena, right? A match where Serena had, this was what she called her last tournament, the U.S. Open last year. She also had been playing great. Serena had just taken out the number 2 seed, and played well in that match too. But Tomljanovic handled the pressure, handled the nerves, maybe handled any expectations that were there for her, and was able to bring out her a great performance, able to get the win as well. And I think her compete level, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Brian, her compete level in that match was really solid, right? If you didn't see the emotions, you didn't see the ups and downs, you didn't see, yeah, her struggle to handle that moment. And yeah, I think it would be interesting to hear from her. Did she learn from maybe things that happened earlier in the year, things that have happened in the past, and maybe recognized, you know, forms of pressure that weren't necessarily helpful, that she was putting on herself, because she did seem to grow as the year went on, especially in that moment.
For sure. Yeah. So um, that's one good thing to look forward to for part two, right? Um, Next theme, and maybe part of this is related, Josh, but um, self belief and locker room power to a certain extent. When we were talking earlier, this was during the time of year when Rafa Nadal was having great success. He was undefeated going into Indian Wells, and he was just sort of like a shadow figure in like 3 of the 5 episodes. And obviously, he won the Australian and he won the French. And the way the guys are talking about playing Rafa, it's you're talking about playing this mythical figure, this legend of the game, and it has to be very difficult to bring the true self belief against players like Rafa, Roger, Novak when you're playing them because of what they have achieved and just how they are mentally, the kind of presence they have, that kind of locker room power. So I thought that was an interesting dynamic there. And I loved in episode 5 how they sort of cinematically showed Felix in the tunnel waiting for his match against Rafa, and then the same with Casper Ruud. And you just see this empty doorway, sort of black. And then Rafa enters the tunnel, and it's almost like this, the Grim Reaper has come, or Darth Vader is now here. And it just brought like such a different presence to the tunnel once he walked in. At least that was just the feeling I got as a viewer. I just thought it was tremendous television there. And you see him very energetic, getting warmed up. And Felix was describing that at a certain point. And this is part of that locker room power that Rafa has created, and more on locker room power, go to our episode with David Samuel talking about that. But just this professionalism, this aura of perhaps even invincibility that can get in players' heads. And certainly I think that was a big part of the final of the French with Casper Ruud. And, they had a relationship already. Ruud mentioned that he never even beat Rafa in a practice set or practice match. And he's playing his idol. So that was difficult. I think with Berrettini in the second episode, there's some good stuff about self belief there as well. Like his whole career has been like, not the typical rise of a player, right? He was not really considered much of a player as a youngster, but really grew into his body and has become something. And I like the way, Josh, that he is sort of phrasing this as looking at this as a journey. I thought he even had the perspective, a lot of what he's going through are just sort of necessary experiences for him to build on and that he's going to keep getting closer and closer. So I thought that was good, and that also shows a level of self belief in that I believe I can achieve my goals. Right? No one match is going to invalidate all the work that I've done, or is indicative that I will not. It's I will build upon this, and so um, I thought that that was some interesting. I didn't know a lot about him, but I thought I really enjoyed listening to his perspectives on like his career, where he had come from, and where he wanted to go. Um, and hopefully he will continue to get better as well.
Yeah, I didn't know a lot about his journey either, so I think that I'm glad that the series illuminated some of that. Yeah, I wanted to go back to that moment with Nadal in the locker room as well, and I'm glad that you brought up this concept of locker room power. And we had an episode with David Samuel, who has coached on the ATP tour for a long time, has written a book called Locker Room Power, and we discussed this with him in episode 56 of the Tennis IQ podcast. If people want to check it out. Um, and really, yeah, this idea that certain legends of the game, and maybe there's moments where they have that locker room power more than others. So I don't think it's like a fixed thing necessarily, but certainly Nadal at the French Open, Djokovic at the Australian Open, Swiatek, I think last year and now as well. Um, Even Sabalenka and the way that she has really transformed her game and her mental game and taken things to the next level. But I think there are these players where they're almost this unstoppable force, and I think or at least they're perceived that way. And in the locker room, I think sometimes they manage to either win the match or at least give themselves a better chance just based on their presence that they bring out in the locker room before the match even starts. And I think you saw that with Casper Ruud in his first Grand Slam final, and sort of standing there, maybe a bit nervous, maybe not sure what to expect. And then you see this looming figure, this sort of almost larger than life figure of Nadal in the background, being very physical, moving around, doing his sort of physical warm up in the locker room, uh, and it almost felt like at that point the match was over. Or at least that's the way that the show made it seem. And I think we saw, in terms of the impact, Nadal went out there, played really well. Casper Ruud's, level maybe wasn't his best that particular day. And I think, and again, it's tough to go out there and face a legend in those sorts of circumstances. But, I think that what happened before they even stepped onto the court had a lot to do with that. So I like that they highlighted that moment. And yeah, I think their locker room power exists certainly on the ATP WTA tours, and it exists at tennis clubs, tennis parks, parks, all sorts of places where people play tennis. There are those figures who have a reputation, who win the match before it even starts. And I think, I think it really is relatable, right? And, it's again a unique circumstance, right? Nadal at the French Open where he's been almost unbeatable, but I think it was really good that they highlighted that because it is a reality that, you know, somebody's reputation and the way that they carry themselves can make a huge impact when the match actually begins.
Yeah. And I think two examples of people actually handling it well, playing against Nadal, were Taylor Fritz at Indian Wells. And I would say even Felix at the French, right? He got to a fifth set. Not many people have done that with Nadal at Roland Garros. Um, and it was interesting, though, how Felix, in his commentary with respect to the match against Nadal, noted how Rafa had raised his level a couple of times in the match, and one of them being in the fifth. So it would be interesting if we could possibly measure where was Felix's belief in that fifth. Was it strong enough, right? Did he feel like he could actually do that? Where at Indian Wells, I think we'll get a little bit more of this in terms of Taylor Fritz in our next theme. In some ways, his injury before the match maybe that helped. Maybe that reduced his expectations of doing anything, knowing he was a little bit compromised and just wanted to try to play some clean tennis at that point. Um, but he obviously held a high standard for what he was doing, and self belief has to be a part of that. And he pulled off, one of the best victories of his career. So I thought actually both of them handled it well. Um, to play a 5-set match against Nadal at Roland Garros is obviously not easy, and maybe there's another locker room power thing there as well. All right, you get into a 5th set against Nadal, again a legend. Be interesting to know how he handled that, but I thought both of them did good jobs of dealing with it and working on their own self belief to get that deep into the match. And obviously, Fritz won. Um, you could certainly argue that Nadal was somewhat compromised in that match, but perhaps Taylor Fritz was as well. And you learn a little bit more about that in that 3rd episode. I don't think we, Josh, knew exactly how serious that particular injury was that Fritz experienced in practice earlier that day.
Totally, totally. Yeah, I certainly didn't. I mean, I remember there was, some sort of injury that he had sort of in the background, but definitely didn't know that it was to the point where his whole team was telling him to not play, and that sort of that theme of stubbornness that they referred to, earlier in the episode would come out in this moment. So I thought that was very interesting, and yeah, he had the self-belief that he wanted to go out there, that this was a huge moment for him. He also grew up in Southern California, not too far away. I think he's, as a kid had been to Indian Wells and everything. So I think, it was really important for him that he at least went out there and tried to play. And, we could have seen a very different result. We could have seen either somebody who went out there for a couple games, had to retire due to an injury. We could have seen him make the injury a lot worse. But he went out there and he realized that there's almost that moment where he realized, hey, I can actually play. I can actually do this. And I know he had taken, some precautions, or I think maybe some painkillers or whatever the situation was to allow him to actually play. And I know Nadal's body actually impacted him that day. So it seemed like he wanted to go out there and give himself a chance by being out there, and that's what ended up happening. He gave himself a chance and ended up actually winning the match. So I think yeah, I think I like that you highlighted those moments of self-belief.
And you brought up the stubbornness part because I think that leads into self-awareness and self-knowledge about who you are, and maybe what you need. And yeah, so it's early in the episode he talks about stubbornness and that he's a stubborn person, and sometimes it works to his detriment, and other times it works to help him. And then that's clearly on display when everybody on his team is telling him, don't play. And he's like, I want to play, I want to play, I want to play. And just the level of motivation and drive that you see there is impressive, even though there were potential really negative consequences, but it ended up being a huge win for him. So I thought that was one good example of self-knowledge, self-awareness, really understanding your own sort of recipe for creating great performance. What was another episode, instance of that in the series, Josh, that you noticed?
Of the self-awareness piece,
Yeah, the self-knowledge. Yeah.
self-awareness, self-knowledge. I mean, I think with Kyrgios, in terms of knowing himself, understanding that he likes being in a team environment. I mean, he's talked about sort of the struggles of tennis as an individual sport, which I know other players have talked about. Agassi famously talked about that in his book. Other players have talked about sort of that loneliness as well. And I think he's craved that, both I know he loves basketball and playing. And that way he seems to really thrive in some of these team events like the Laver Cup, for instance, and Davis Cup, where he's played. And I think, him knowing himself, knowing that he likes that team aspect and deciding to play doubles with not just anybody, but Kokonakis, is somebody who he's been buddies with for a really long time, and the two of them are extremely close. Um, yeah, I like that they highlighted that because he he took that information, that self-knowledge about himself, and was able to really run with it, and the result was that they, won a Grand Slam title, which is, something that he hadn't done, that neither of them had done before. It was in doubles. But yeah, there was I think that was a moment just where his self-knowledge, he was able to really utilize that to bring out some of his best performances, and I think also just recognize, and I remember him talking about this during the tournament, just, he recognized sort of the day in, day out level that had to be brought out to win a Grand Slam, right? Which I think is something that he's struggled with, sort of bringing out that consistent effort, that consistent level, lifestyle, all of the above. But I think because his environment was right, because he was able to turn tennis into a team setting and play doubles with someone who he's very close with, he was able to bring out that consistency, bring out that high level, bring out those positive emotions, which we saw, and end up winning the tournament.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think it also helped, him create the right kind of energy, positive energy, physical energy in his performances. And in the part two teaser, there's obviously going to be more discussion of Nick with his performance at Wimbledon. So
Yep.
it'd be very interesting to see that. I think the other good example of more self knowledge was Berrettini and his discussion of how he uses pressure and fear to really drive his top level. And he noted in one of his matches that for some reason the fear wasn't there, and so he wasn't finding his top level. And then at a certain point, it kicked in, and he got better. And I bring that up in terms of because somebody actually that I work with brought this up to me as a theme, and sort of wondering, well, is that something I should be doing? And so we had a really good discussion on it, that this is a process of all of us discovering what is our own relationship, say, with pressure and fear and challenges and threats and opportunities, and understanding the mixture of, you know, where am I with enjoyment? Where am I with pressure? What's my focus like at my best? What's my confidence? What's my belief, right? And understanding that this is a specific recipe or mixture for all of us. And what we see here is, Matteo Berrettini has a really good sense of what it is for him. But many of us are still in the process of discovering our own recipe for all of these factors and knowing how to put them together to drive good performance. So it's great to hear him talk about that, but we don't necessarily want to say, "Oh, that's what I should do." You could certainly try it and have the experience with it, but we're all individuals with respect to how this stuff works. So it's a lot of, when we talk about self knowledge and self awareness, it takes some experimentation, it takes experience to know what works for you. And so I thought it was kind of really very interesting to hear Berrettini talk about what it is that he needs, and how it factored into his Australian Open experience that particular year.
Totally, totally. And I think that even maybe caused some friction between him and Tomljanovic, where we saw, he had played a long match, was looking to recover, and I know there was the issue where Tomljanovic had an interview
Right, with Tennis
the
Channel.
the next morning with Tennis Channel, and that was, I think, an interesting scene there. But yeah, I think, and that self-awareness doesn't people don't generally start their career with that self-awareness. That's something that, or never, right? That's something that comes from experience. I mean, and we see this with so many players where they take experiences that they've had, whether it be losses, whether it be moments where they didn't feel like they handled it as well as they could have, and they grow from it. And we could talk about Tomljanovic in terms of, her performance, in some of the matches that were highlighted, compared to later in the season. We can talk about Federer and how he, seemed to take his experiences as a junior player, even a younger professional player, as someone who was, really hot-tempered, would throw and break rackets, and transformed into this more calm, easygoing player on the court that I think helped him have the success that he did in his career. So, yeah, I think that self-awareness is a process. It's a process. It takes time. It takes those ups and downs to happen to build that and to be able to ultimately use that um, as you're competing to help you bring out your best stuff.
Yeah, it's a never-ending process. Like mastery of anything, there's always more levels of awareness and discovery and proficiency, etc. Right. So that's a quick review of the Netflix series Breakpoint. Um, Thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out our show notes. If you have any feedback or questions about the series or other themes that you thought were interesting, feel free to email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiq/membership. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.